The needle on the polygraph had barely twitched when Miriam Osei realized the man strapped into the chair across the glass wasn't lying about the money. He was lying about something worse. She pressed her fingers flat against the cold metal of the observation desk and read the readout again. 42 years old. Chief Financial Officer of Hargrove Capital, one of the most quietly powerful investment firms in the country. A man who owned a sailboat he never sailed and a charity named after his mother. And right now, on a Tuesday afternoon in a glass tower in downtown Toronto, he was about to sign a restructuring agreement that would quietly transfer pension liabilities to 1,200 retired postal workers across Ontario and Quebec. Miriam wasn't supposed to be in that room. She was a document courier. She wore a lanyard that said Messenger Services, and she carried a sealed envelope that was supposed to go to the paralegal on the 31st floor. But the elevator had stopped on 29, and a woman in heels had gotten on, jabbing 32 with her elbow without looking up. And Miriam had missed her floor entirely. When she got out at 32, the receptionist had waved her straight through toward the boardroom, because apparently they were expecting a courier after all, just not her. And the actual document she was holding happened to be a draft amendment, which no one had told her to keep sealed. She'd learned about clauses like this one from her brother. Kwame had spent 8 months untangling exactly this kind of language from their father's business contracts after he died. Their father had run a small moving company in Scarborough, built it over 22 years with 3 vans, and a reputation for showing up when he said he would. He'd been approached by a larger logistics firm wanting to merge, and the lawyer he'd hired had been, as it turned out, also on the retainer of the larger firm. Buried on page 9 of the agreement was an indemnity transfer clause. When the larger firm's drivers were involved in a workplace accident and the liability came down, it came down on their father's name. The legal costs had taken everything: the company, the house in Scarborough, and eventually, Miriam believed, her father himself, who had died 18 months later from a heart attack, at 61, sitting in the plastic chair of a legal aid office waiting for an appointment that would come too late. She recognized the clause the way you recognize someone's handwriting. Not the words exactly, but the shape of them, the intention folded inside the syntax. The man in the boardroom was named Elliot Hargrove. Not the founder's son. He had the kind of jaw that suggested a private school somewhere cold, and the posture of a man who had never once worried about whether his electricity would be cut off. Beside him sat 3 other men in suits and a woman who was clearly his lawyer, and at the end of the table, on the opposite side, sat a man Miriam hadn't noticed at first because he was so still. He wasn't reading the document in front of him. He was watching the other people read theirs. His name came to her in pieces, the way names do when you've heard them in passing rather than in conversation. Beckett. Navarro. No, that wasn't right. She'd seen his name in a business magazine, one of those profiles they do of people who are described as visionaries, before anyone finds out what they're actually a visionary of. Navarro something. Or something Navarro. He was younger than the others, mid-30s maybe. He wore a dark jacket with no tie, which in this boardroom was the visual equivalent of arriving on horseback. His hair was dark and pushed back from his face, and there was a stillness to him that reminded Miriam, oddly, of her father's old dog, who used to sit motionless in the yard and then catch a squirrel so fast you weren't sure you'd seen it happen. He picked up his pen. Miriam was still holding her envelope. The paralegal who was supposed to receive it was somewhere on 31. She had no reason to be standing in this hallway, looking through this window, doing what she was about to do. She thought of her father in that plastic chair. She pushed open the door. 7 people looked at her. She focused on the man with the pen. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I have a glance at the envelope. "Mr. Solano." The woman who was the lawyer said sharply, "There's no Solano in this meeting. I'm so sorry," Miriam said. She was already moving to the end of the table, reaching to set down the envelope near the water glasses, and she bent slightly as if to check the name on it again, her face level with the shoulder of the man who was about to sign. She could smell leather and something cold, like winter air still clinging to a coat. She kept her voice barely above a breath. "Page 6, she said. The indemnification rollover. It transfers the pension exposure to the counterparty upon any regulatory finding. They're going to report you and collect." She straightened, picked up her envelope, said to the room, "I'm sorry for the interruption," and walked out. She made it to the elevator. She pressed the button. The doors did not open. Behind her, she heard the boardroom door. "Stop!" The voice was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that didn't need to be loud. She turned around. The man with the pen was standing in the hallway. The door had swung shut behind him. He was taller than he'd looked through the glass. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, the way you look at something you're trying to figure out if it's real. "Who sent you?" he said. "No one." Miriam said, "I'm a courier. I took the wrong elevator. You read a legal document in under 30 seconds and identified a liability transfer clause." "My father signed one," she said. "I know what they look like." Something in his expression shifted. It wasn't softening exactly. It was more like a door opening in a wall you hadn't realized was a wall. "Your name," he said. "Miriam. Who do you work for, Miriam?" "Rapid dispatch. On King Street." He looked at the envelope in her hand, then back at her face. In the distance, through the glass walls, she could see the boardroom. The other men were talking. The lawyer was on her phone. "You need to leave this building," he said. "I was trying to," she said, "not the floor. The building. Now. Don't go back to your office. Don't go home for at least 2 hours." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a card, plain white with nothing but a phone number. "Call this when you're somewhere you've never been before." Miriam stared at the card. "I don't understand. The man across from me in there," he said, "is named Philip Stern. He is not simply a businessman. He has been arranging financial traps like the one you just identified for 11 years, and the woman who is his lawyer has twice made witnesses to those arrangements disappear from public records." "I don't mean metaphorically." The elevator dinged. The doors opened. He gestured to them with a motion that was not unkind. "Go," he said. "Please." She went. The coffee shop she chose was a Vietnamese place on Spadina she'd never been to because it was slightly too far from anything she regularly did. She ordered something sweet and sat at the back and called the number. He picked up on the first ring. "Good," he said. "Stay where you are. I'll be there in 40 minutes. You don't know where I am. You said somewhere you've never been. That narrows it to roughly 1,200 coffee shops. I'll find the Vietnamese one on Spadina." She almost asked how he knew, but she suspected the answer would not be simple. He arrived in 37 minutes. He'd changed out of the jacket. He sat down across from her without ceremony and ordered nothing and folded his hands on the table. "My name is Sebastian Navarro," he said. "I run a private equity firm called Navarro Holdings. Stern has been trying to acquire a controlling interest in one of my subsidiary companies for 14 months, and what I signed today, or nearly signed, would have accomplished that acquisition while also attaching a regulatory liability to my name that would have made it impossible to fight him in court." "The pension rollover?" "Yes." He studied her. "How did you know what it was?" Miriam told him about her father. She had not planned to. She'd told the story before. To her brother and to the legal aid lawyer, and once, badly, at a dinner with people who didn't know her well enough for it. But sitting here with this stranger who had nearly lost everything to the same trick, the story came out plainly, without the careful phrasing she usually used to manage other people's discomfort. It came out like a fact. When she finished, Sebastian Navarro was quiet for a moment. "Stern did the same thing to a Quebec manufacturer in 2019, he said, and a shipping cooperative in Halifax in 2021. The clause is slightly different each time, but the architecture is identical. Has anyone sued him? 3 people have tried. 1 settled under a non-disclosure. 1 died of a stroke. He looked at his hands. 1 disappeared, literally. Left his apartment in Ottawa one morning and was never reported missing because he had no family." Miriam set down her cup. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "That depends," he said, "on whether you're willing to help me. I'm a courier." "You were a courier," he said. "Before today, you were a courier. What were you before that?" She hadn't told him that part. "How do you know there's a before that?" "Because you read a legal indemnification clause at a glance and understood its implications. That is not general knowledge." Miriam looked out the window at the street. A woman was walking a dog that was wearing a small plaid jacket. The normality of it felt almost funny. "I studied accounting," she said. "For 2 years at Ryerson, before my dad got sick. I was going to do forensic accounting. I was good at it. I believe you," he said. "I couldn't afford to go back after he died." "I know," he said, which she suspected meant he didn't know yet but would shortly. "I need someone who can read financial structures the way you just read that clause. I have documents." Stern's firm has been under informal SEC and OSFI scrutiny for years, but nothing has ever stuck because the paper trail is deliberately layered. Shell companies inside holding trusts inside numbered corporations. The people at the regulatory bodies don't have time to go 3 layers deep, and you think I can? "I think you already want to," he said. "I think that's why you walked into that boardroom." He wasn't wrong. She told him she needed a day to think. He gave her his real contact information, not just the number, but an address in the distillery district, an office, public. He told her to verify it was real before she came, which she did, and it was. She went home that night and sat on the floor of her apartment with her laptop and her father's old file box, which she had been dragging from place to place for 4 years without being able to open. She opened it. She read everything. She called her brother, Quam, who was a paralegal in Mississauga. He said after a long pause, "You're not seriously thinking about this." And then, after another pause, "I'll help you with the cross-referencing." She went to the distillery district the next morning. The office was on the second floor of a converted brick building. There were two people there besides Sebastian. A woman named Harriet, who managed operations with the energy of someone who had arranged complicated things under difficult conditions for a very long time. And a man named Tad, who was in his 20s and did not seem entirely sure why he was in the room, but was very fast at finding corporate registry information. Miriam sat down at the table they cleared for her and started reading. It took 4 days. She slept poorly. She ate the food Harriet brought without tasting it. Sebastian came in the mornings, reviewed what she'd found, and disappeared to make calls she wasn't privy to. Occasionally he came and stood beside her to look at a document, and she was aware of him the way you're aware of weather, not intrusively but constantly. On the 4th night she found it. It was in the subsidiary structure of a numbered holding company registered in Manitoba. Stern's firm had guaranteed loans against a real estate portfolio, commercial properties in Calgary and Montreal, using pension assets from a mid-sized public sector union as collateral. The assets had been commingled in a way that was technically legal under a loophole that had been present since 2009 and had never been tested. If the real estate portfolio lost value, which it was already beginning to, quietly as interest rates shifted, the pension fund would absorb the shortfall. Thousands of people's retirements, used as ballast for a gamble they didn't know was being made. She felt the same thing she'd felt looking at her father's contract. Not surprise. Rage. She went to find Sebastian. He was on the phone when she walked in, and he held up one finger without looking at her, which she ignored. "I found it," she said. He ended his call. She laid it out. The guarantee structure, the pension, co-mingling, the real estate exposure, the specific mechanism by which Stern's firm would be insulated, and the pension fund would not. He listened without speaking, leaning against the desk, his arms crossed, his expression the same controlled stillness he seemed to default to. When she finished, he said, "Can you document the chain?" "I already did. All the way back to the numbered company?" "All the way back," she said, "to Stern's personal signing authority." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. More like a person who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down soon. "There's a problem," he said. "The guarantor documentation requires biometric authorization," Miriam said. "I know. I was going to mention that." He looked at her. "How did you know that?" "Because I found the authorization protocol in the annex of the Manitoba Incorporation documents. Stern set it up specifically so that asset transfers require his thumbprint on a hardware key. Nothing moves without it, including a clawback, so we need Stern himself to authorize the clawback." Sebastian said, "Which he will not voluntarily do." "He might," Miriam said, "if we give him a reason." She had been thinking about this for most of the past 12 hours. Stern had one vulnerability she'd identified in everything she'd read. He was meticulous to the point of paranoia about his professional reputation. Not his legal reputation, his social one. He cared about being seen as legitimate. There was a chair he sat on at 2 charity boards. He had a profile in Report on Business magazine that described him as a pillar of the Toronto financial community. He had a great deal to lose if what he'd done with the pension assets became public before he'd had time to manage the narrative. "There's a conference," she said. "The National Investment Forum. It's in Ottawa in 5 days. Stern is delivering the keynote." Sebastian waited. "If we can get the documentation to a specific journalist who covers pension fund oversight. I found her work in a CRTC file from 2022. She's been trying to crack the commingling story for 3 years. We can threaten to release it during the conference. Stern would have 48 hours to either authorize the clawback voluntarily, which neutralizes the pension exposure, or face the story breaking while he's standing at a podium in front of every major financial regulator in the country." Sebastian was very still. "That only works," he said, "if he believes we'll actually do it." "We will actually do it," Miriam said. "If he doesn't authorize the clawback, the journalist gets everything. He'll know it came from me. Yes, he'll come after my firm." "He'll try," Miriam said. "But with the authorization completed and the pension assets protected, his legal exposure is significant. The coming after you will be expensive and noisy, and he'll have to do it while being investigated." Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. She had the distinct sense that he was recalibrating something. "You were going to be a forensic accountant," he said. "I was going to be very good at it," she said. The conference was in 5 days. They had to move. Harriet sourced press credentials from a contact in Ottawa she didn't explain. Tad built a secure file transfer protocol that would send everything to the journalist, Wendy Park at the Financial Accountability Review, at a scheduled time unless manually cancelled. Sebastian made calls that resulted in a secure meeting being arranged at the Chateau Laurier. Not in a conference room, but in a hotel bar, which was public enough to be safe and contained enough to be controlled. Miriam arrived at the Chateau Laurier on a Thursday evening in a blazer she'd borrowed from Harriet, and shoes she'd bought from a thrift shop on Queen Street because her own were wrong, and she didn't want to think about her shoes while she was doing this. Her hair was down. She'd been told she would be introduced as a financial analyst. She had the documentation on a tablet. The bar was busy. Stern was already there when she arrived, seated in a corner booth with a man she didn't recognize. He looked exactly like his photographs, compact, precise, with eyes that moved constantly across the room. She was not supposed to go in alone. Sebastian was to follow her in by 6 minutes. She sat down anyway. "Mr. Stern," she said. He looked at her. "Do I know you?" "No," she said, "but you know my employer, and I believe you've been expecting someone to find you about the Manitoba pension guarantees." Whatever ease had been in his face went out like a light. The man beside him, a bodyguard, she realized, shifted. "I don't know what you're talking about," Stern said. "You might want to read this," Miriam said, and placed the tablet on the table. He didn't touch it, but he looked. She watched his eyes track down the first page and knew the moment he understood what he was seeing. "This is fabricated," he said. "It's from the Manitoba Corporate Registry, the Ontario Pension Benefits Database, and your own firm's internal authorization logs. We have an annotated copy for Wendy Park at the Financial Accountability Review. She receives it at 9 a.m. Friday unless I call the system and cancel." Stern leaned back. The bodyguard had both hands on the table now. "You're threatening me," Stern said. "I'm offering you a window," Miriam said. "Before Friday morning, you authorize the clawback provision in the guarantee structure. The pension assets are separated back to their originating fund. Your real estate exposure becomes your problem, not theirs. You walk away with a restructuring headache, not a criminal one. And if I don't," Miriam looked at him. She thought about her father sitting in the plastic chair of the legal aid office, holding a file folder, wearing the good coat. "Then you give your keynote address," she said, "in front of every pension regulator in the country, on the morning that Wendy Park publishes a documented analysis of how you used municipal workers' retirement savings as collateral for speculative real estate. You can decide which version of the next 5 years you prefer." Stern was quiet for a long moment. Then Sebastian sat down beside her. Stern looked at him, and whatever calculation he'd been running visibly completed itself. "I want guarantees," Stern said. "You'll get a document," Sebastian said. "Prepared by counsel, not yours. You authorize the clawback tonight. We witness it. The pension fund is made whole, and the documentation doesn't go to the journalist. And Navarro Holdings drops the acquisition entirely," Sebastian said. "I have no interest in your company anymore, Philip. I never did. I was interested in getting you away from mine." Stern looked at the tablet. He looked at Sebastian. He looked at Miriam in a way that made her feel like he was trying to place her, to figure out what she was, what kind of thing she represented. "Fine," he said. "They did it in the hotel business center at 11:30 that night." Stern produced the hardware key from a slim case in his jacket pocket. Miriam ran the protocol on the secure laptop Tad had configured. The biometric scanner read Stern's thumbprint. The system prompted. She entered the authorization sequence. For 45 seconds, the screen showed a progress bar. Then, transfer complete. Originating fund restored. 1,200 retired postal workers in Ontario and Quebec, who would never know this evening had happened, would find their pension fund intact when the quarterly statement came. Miriam sat back in the chair and breathed. In the parking garage afterward, Stern left without looking back. His bodyguard held the door. Sebastian and Miriam stood under the yellow-orange lights among the parked cars. "He'll try something else," Miriam said. "Probably," Sebastian said. "But the documentation is still with Tad. And now we have a signed authorization on file. It's not a sword over him, but it's a shield." "It's not enough," she said. "He'll do this to someone else." "I know." They were both quiet for a moment. "Send Wendy Park the analysis anyway," Miriam said. "Not the full document. Not enough to constitute a breach of the agreement, but enough that she knows where to look." He looked at her sidelong. "That's a very thin legal distinction." "My brother is a paralegal," she said. "He can help us get it right." Sebastian almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to it. Not the controlled versions he showed in meetings, but something real, slightly surprised. "Come back on Monday. I want to offer you something. A job? A role," he said. "Not courier, not analyst. Something we'd need to define together." He paused. "I've been trying to do this work for 3 years with people who are excellent at what they each do individually. I've never had anyone who could see the whole picture while standing inside it. She thought about Kwam, who had asked her twice this week if she was sleeping. She thought about her apartment in Scarborough, the file box she'd finally opened. She thought about her father's company van, the blue one with the dent in the side door, which she used to fall asleep in as a kid while he finished deliveries. I have conditions, she said. I'd expect that, he said. My brother is involved in any legal structuring. I want him to have a formal role, not just consultation. Done, and I want to finish my designation. Part-time. The firm pays tuition. Done, and, she said, whatever we build, we do not use pension assets as collateral for anything. I don't care how clean the legal structure is. Not ever. He held out his hand, an old-fashioned gesture. She shook it. 2 months later, Wendy published a long-form investigation into the use of pension fund assets as loan collateral in private equity transactions. She named no specific individuals and cited only regulatory filings and public documents. The piece prompted an OSFI review of guarantee structures in 3 provinces. Philip Stern declined to comment. Miriam read the piece on her phone on the subway to her night class, accounting theory, second time through the curriculum, and this time she was going to finish. She got off at Rierson and walked up the steps and held the door for the person behind her the way her father always had, because he said it cost nothing and meant something. Her phone buzzed. A message from Sebastian. She'd read it later, but she could see the first line. The Manitoba file came back clean. First audit in 4 years. She put her phone away and went to class. And somewhere in a suburb of Quebec City, a retired postal worker named Edouard Beaumont opened his quarterly pension statement, saw the expected number, set the paper on the kitchen table beside his coffee, and went back to reading his newspaper, completely unaware that 3 weeks earlier, a woman he would never meet had stayed up until 2 in the morning to make sure that number was still there.